Callahan's daughter, Fort Liberty, North Carolina, 1930. The rain had been falling for 2 hours and showed no interest in stopping. On the roof of Building 31, a figure lay face down on wet gravel, small, maybe 5'3", maybe 119 pounds soaking wet, which she was. The kind of person you would walk past in a grocery store and forget before you reach the next aisle. The rifle under her hands was not small. The Macmillan TAC-338 is 30 pounds of precision engineering chambered for a cartridge that can reach out past 1,000 meters and still have enough energy to end a life cleanly. In the right hands, it is not a weapon, it is a statement. She settled her cheek against the stock. Her breathing slowed, then slowed again, then nearly stopped. 823 meters to the first target, wind out of the southwest at 25 knots, gusting unpredictably. Rain falling at a slight angle. Temperature dropping 2 degrees from the morning. Reading which changes the air density, which changes the bullet's flight, which changes everything if you are not accounting for it. She was accounting for it. The first shot made almost no sound at all. A suppressed rifle at distance sounds less like a gunshot and more like someone closing a heavy book. What it produced 823 meters away was not quiet at all. The first man dropped. She was already moving the rifle before he hit the ground. The second shot, the second man, the third. 14 rounds, 12 kills, 13 minutes and 47 seconds. The Army spent 6 months trying to explain how it was possible. They interviewed every witness. They analyzed the shot angles, the wind data, the trajectory of each round. They ran the numbers through ballistic computers that cost more than most people's houses. The answer they eventually came to was simpler than any of them expected. And it had nothing to do with that night. It had everything to do with a dead man who had been teaching his daughter to shoot since she was 8 years old. 15 hours earlier. 4:30 in the morning is a particular kind of dark. Not the dark of midnight, which still carries the memory of the day before. Not the dark of 3 a.m., which is the hour of insomnia and regret. 4:30 is the dark that comes just before the body starts to understand that morning is coming, whether you want it or not. It is an honest dark, unforgiving, indifferent. A 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and 211,000 miles on the odometer pulled into the parking area outside the Fort Liberty sniper qualification range. The engine made a sound when it shut off that suggested it was grateful for the rest. The door opened. The boots that touched the asphalt were old. Military surplus worn down at the heel, the left sole separated slightly from the upper and held in place with a strip of duct tape that had been replaced recently enough to still be gray instead of black. The range bag that followed those boots out of the car looked like it might have been new sometime during the Reagan administration. The woodland camo uniform was at least 2 sizes too large, the sleeves rolled up twice at the cuff. Sarah Callahan stood in the parking lot for a moment and looked at the range buildings. She was 26 years old, though nothing about the way she stood suggested youth. She stood the way people stand when they have spent time in places where standing incorrectly gets you killed. Weight distributed evenly, back straight but not rigid. Eyes moving without the head moving, taking in the entrances, the light sources, the other vehicles already in the lot. Processing. Filing. She picked up her bag and walked toward the check-in building, and the only sound her boots made on the asphalt was almost no sound at all. There are things you need to understand about Colonel James Callahan before this story makes the kind of sense it deserves to make. He spent 34 years in the United States Army. The last 19 of those years he spent at Fort Liberty, building and running one of the most demanding sniper programs in the military. He was not a famous man. You will not find his name in many books. Fame was something he considered a liability in his profession, and he actively avoided it the way other men avoid spiders or heights. What he built at Fort Liberty was not famous either. But the men who came through his program, the ones who passed, they knew what they had been given. 3 generations of graduates, each one carrying something of him into the field, into the work, into the places where precision and patience and absolute calm under pressure are the difference between mission success and a flag folded into a triangle and handed to someone's wife. He had 127 confirmed kills over the course of his career. He mentioned this fact to no one and wrote it in no memoir. It existed in classified records and in his own memory, and in neither place did it make him proud in any conventional sense of the word. It simply was what it was. A number. A record of decisions made correctly under circumstances that demanded correctness. He taught Sarah to shoot when she was 8 years old. Not because he wanted her to be a soldier. He was not that kind of father. He taught her because He believed competence was the greatest gift you could pass from one generation to the next. And because he could see in his daughter at age 8 what most people never develop at any age, stillness, the ability to be completely present in a single moment, to let everything that is not essential fall away until only the task remains. By the time she was 12, she could outshoot most of his students. He never told her that, but she knew. He died 18 months before she drove that Honda Civic into the Fort Liberty parking lot. Lung cancer, which is a common way for men of his generation and his habits to die, which he faced with the same flat, quiet acceptance he had brought to everything else in his life. He did not rage. He did not bargain. He simply organized his affairs, said what needed to be said, and waited with the patience of a man who had spent decades learning that timing is everything. What he said to Sarah in those last weeks, she kept mostly to herself. What is known is that he gave her 2 instructions. The first, don't let it go to waste. Finish what I started. The second was not from him. It was from her mother, Margaret Callahan, who was 61 years old and living in Raleigh, and had spent 30 years managing the particular anxiety of loving a man who did dangerous things for a living. Margaret's instruction was simpler and carried more weight for being simple. Come home safe. 1 Callahan buried is enough. 2 instructions, 2 directions. No way to honor both of them completely. Sarah had been living inside that contradiction for 18 months when she walked into the check-in building at 4:31 on a Tuesday morning and signed her name on the intake form for the Fort Liberty Advanced Sniper Qualification course. Colonel Callahan had been investigating something before he got sick. 3 of his graduates, 3 of the men he had personally trained and certified over the past 4 years, had died in Afghanistan within a 14-month period. Separate incidents, separate locations, different units, different missions, but each one had been killed in what the official reports called unexpected enemy contact, ambushes, the kind of engagement where the enemy knew where to be and when, which means someone had told them. James Callahan spent the last healthy year of his life building a quiet case. He was careful. He told almost no one what he was doing. He looked at the operational timelines, the intelligence chains, the personnel files of everyone who had access to his graduates' deployment information. What he found or believed he had found pointed to one man, Lieutenant Harlan Briggs, an instructor at the sniper school. Unremarkable service record. Financially careful in ways that do not quite add up to his salary when you examine the records closely enough. The kind of man who has learned to be invisible by never doing anything that calls attention to himself, except that invisibility itself, when it is practiced too deliberately, leaves its own kind of trace. James Callahan got sick before he could bring what he had to anyone official. The cancer moved faster than the investigation. He gave Sarah what he had, his notes, his timeline, the name, and something else. He had made arrangements, specific, careful, forward-looking arrangements, the kind that a man makes when he understands that the work will continue after he is gone and that the person continuing it will need things he can position in advance. He had spent time in those final months that his family believed was devoted to rest. Some of it was, but some of it was phone calls and paperwork and the quiet movement of assets into positions where they would be available to the right person at the right time. He did not explain all of this to Sarah. He gave her what she needed to move forward: the access codes, the location of a specific item in a specific inventory, a name she could trust, and the understanding of what that name would do without being asked. Finish what I started. And so she drove to Fort Liberty in a car that barely ran, wearing a uniform 2 sizes too large, carrying gear that looked like it belonged to someone's grandfather, and she signed her name on the intake form and waited for what came next. She already knew what Briggs looked like. She already knew his schedule, his habits, his access patterns. She knew which personnel files he had accessed and when. She needed to be inside the program to reach the final piece of evidence that would make the case impossible to ignore or dismiss. She had not told anyone what she was doing. Not her mother. Not the handful of friends who still called. Not anyone within the Army's official structure, because the Army's official structure had a leak, and one of those leaks had already cost 3 men their lives. She tightened her left bootlace at the check-in door. Then she walked inside. The men already in the intake room when she entered were the type that military programs attract in disproportionate numbers. Large, loud in the way that men are loud when they are performing for each other rather than communicating. The kind of loud that is inversely proportional to the uncertainty they are actually carrying. They occupied the far table in the intake room, 4 of them arranged with the easy comfort of an established hierarchy, with a 5th figure leaning against the wall in a posture that managed to suggest both relaxation and territorial claim simultaneously. Garrison Drake was 6'2" and built in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. Shaved head, a scar along the left jaw that he wore with the practiced casualness of a man who has decided it makes him more interesting. 31 years old. He had spent those years becoming excellent at a specific set of things and had never once examined whether those were the right things to be excellent at. His group arranged around him with the ease of long familiarity. Hawk Braddock, whose call sign referenced a single exceptional shot that he had been trading on for longer than he probably realized. Lefty Culver, quieter than his nickname suggested, watchful in the way of a man whose stillness has weight to it. Doyle Harker, broad and deliberate, who processed the world slowly and thoroughly and arrived at conclusions that tended to be correct. And Stellan Rowe, who stood within the group's orbit but not quite inside it, separated by a distance that was physical enough to be visible if you were paying the right kind of attention. Drake saw Sarah when she walked in. His expression did not shift in any way that would constitute a reaction. It simply became the particular expression he kept ready for situations he had already decided were beneath him, deployed with the automatic ease of long practice. He said nothing yet. He understood the value of timing. The equipment assignment happened at 5:15, managed by the armorer, a master sergeant named Wilkes, who had the energy of a man who had been awake since approximately 1987 and was not particularly pleased about any of it. The other candidates received functional equipment, modern optics, ammunition from consistent production lots. Sarah received Station 13. The rifle was a Barrett M82 that had served in at least 2 theaters of operation and showed the evidence of both. The barrel had what Wilkes described as some wear, which was technically accurate in the way that describing a Category 4 hurricane as some weather is technically accurate. The scope would need adjustment, he said in the tone of a man conveying information he knows will not be useful. The ammunition was match grade, which sounded better than the reality because it came from 3 different production lots with measurably different powder loads, which meant the ballistic behavior would shift between rounds in ways that required constant recalculation if you were skilled enough to notice and impossible to manage if you were not. Station 13 was positioned at the far right of the qualification range, full eastern exposure meaning direct sun in the face by mid-morning. The gap in the protective berms at that end of the range created a wind tunnel effect that amplified the crosswind beyond what the rest of the range experienced. A concrete barrier behind the station would trap brass and powder residue, creating a personal chemical environment with every round fired. Sarah picked up the Barrett M82. She ran her fingers along the barrel, not examining it in the way that someone unfamiliar with the weapon would examine it, measuring it. Her fingertips moving with a precision that spoke of thousands of repetitions in the dark on ranges in conditions that made this morning seem comfortable. She was measuring the barrel deviation without looking at it, using touch the way a blind person uses touch, not as a substitute for sight, but as its own complete and sufficient sense. She set the rifle down, accepted her ammunition allocation without comment, walked to Station 13. Sergeant First Class Gideon Marsh watched this from the observer station 30 meters to the left, his eye at the spotting scope. He had been watching since she walked into the intake room. He had written 2 words in the small brown notebook he kept in his left breast pocket when he saw her measure that barrel with her fingers. The 2 words were who taught her. He knew the answer. He had known it since he saw the intake form 3 days ago and recognized the surname and understood what it meant that James Callahan's daughter had enrolled in the program where James Callahan had spent 19 years. He had known it, and he had said nothing, and he had waited because Drake had told him to wait and because his own instinct confirmed that waiting was the correct approach. He watched her walk to Station 13 and set up her equipment, and he wrote a 3rd word in the notebook. The word was yes. Sergeant Major Aldous Drake was 53 years old, which made him old for this work and precisely right for the specific role he occupied. He had the build of a man who had been genuinely strong in his 30s and had shifted into something denser and more permanent with age. Gray at the temples and in the short beard he maintained within regulation, but only barely. Eyes that had developed over decades of looking at difficult things, the quality of revealing less than they perceived. He had been trained by Colonel James Callahan in 1988. He did not speak about this often. The men who had been genuinely trained by James Callahan, not merely processed through his program, but actually shaped by him, tended not to speak about it. They carried what they had been given and applied it when the situation required, and the application was the testimony rather than any words about it. When Callahan called him 4 months before he died, the conversation had lasted nearly an hour. It covered many things in the way that conversations between careful men cover things obliquely and through implication and with a great deal of weight carried in the spaces between words. What was said explicitly was less important than what was communicated. And what was communicated was this: a man who knows he is dying has arranged what needs to be arranged, and the arrangements require a certain item to remain in a certain location and a certain person to be in a certain position. And when the time comes, the signals will be clear enough. Drake had understood. He had made the call to the duty sergeant at Emergency Arms Room 7 on the morning of the intake, not the night before, and not a week before, but that morning, because James Callahan had taught him that operational security means you limit exposure to the minimum period required, and the minimum period required in this case was measured in hours. He had also initiated a transfer paperwork review because something needed to be verified before the day was done, and the verification required access to records that were not immediately available to him from memory. He watched Sarah walk to Station 13 through the window of the observation post and thought about a man he had known for 30 years and what that man had built and what it meant that the building was still happening, even now from beyond a grave in Raleigh that Drake had stood at in the rain 8 months ago. Then he went back to the administrative work that the morning required. The warm-up qualification was set for 100 meters. This is not a distance that challenges trained snipers. It is a formality, a baseline, a way for the instructors to establish reference points before the genuine tests begin. Drake shot first. He made a production of his preparation that was almost theatrical in its confidence, and the confidence was earned, which made it more irritating rather than less. 10 shots, 10 bullseyes. He stood up with the satisfaction of a man who has done exactly what he expected to do. His group responded with the appreciation of men who know their role in these situations. Lieutenant Harlan Briggs watched from the scoring table with the expression of a man observing something he finds mildly interesting. He was 44 years old, medium height, medium build, the kind of face that photographs as unremarkable and fades from memory quickly. He had learned over a careful career that the most effective posture for a man in his position is to be present without being memorable. He held his clipboard. He made marks on his scoring sheet. He said nothing. He had examined Sarah's application when it arrived. The name had given him a moment of stillness. James Callahan's daughter. He had gone through Callahan's files thoroughly after the old man died, looking for anything that connected to the investigation the old man had been quietly running. He had not found the daughter's name anywhere. He had concluded she was not involved. He was revising that conclusion now, watching her set up at Station 13, watching the way she handled the Barrett M82, with a familiarity that her background documents said she should not have. He wrote a note to himself on the clipboard, not a score. He told himself it was probably nothing. He had been telling himself things were probably nothing for 6 years. The practice had served him well until tonight, when it would serve him not at all. Sarah's turn came 7th in the rotation. She spent 3 minutes adjusting the damaged scope, which generated the predictable commentary from the area around Station 8, where Drake and his group had congregated. The commentary was the kind that men offer when they want an audience to understand how they feel about something without taking direct responsibility for feeling it. She did not react. When she fired, the results appeared to confirm everything Drake had been suggesting. 7 hits, 3 misses, below average for this course. The kind of score that would justify everything anyone had been thinking since she climbed out of that Honda Civic. Gideon Marsh had his spotting scope on Station 13's target before the echo of the last shot faded. He looked for a long time, much longer than the score seemed to warrant. The 7 hits were not scattered in the pattern that a struggling shooter's hits scatter. They were grouped through a single hole offset consistently from the bullseye in one direction by the exact degree that matched the barrel deviation he had noted when he reviewed the weapon assignment paperwork that morning. She had measured the deviation with her fingers before her first shot. She had held the offset in her head through 7 rounds and put them all through the same point of impact. The 3 misses were different. He walked down to the target during the ceasefire and examined them up close. The bullet holes were elongated, irregular. Keyholing, the bullets had destabilized in flight. Not shooter error. Defective rounds. Bad powder loads from a mismatched production lot. Any experienced shooter who had sorted the ammunition by weight before loading would have identified the compromised rounds and placed them at the end of the magazine, intending to use them last, expecting to miss with them, choosing to miss cleanly rather than have their erratic impact contaminate the data from the good rounds. He walked back to the observer station. He wrote 3 more words in the notebook under the first 3. Then he went to find Drake. The 500-meter qualification began at 700. The wind had picked up to 20 knots with gusts that were unpredictable in direction as well as intensity, which is the condition that separates people who can shoot from people who can shoot when the conditions cooperate with them. Drake's group performed well. This point requires emphasis because the story is not about incompetence meeting competence. Drake and Braddock and Culver and Harker were legitimately skilled shooters. The things that happened over the course of this day were not about the gap between their ability and Sarah's. They were about something else which is harder to quantify and more important. The interference began during Sarah's 500-meter shots, subtle initially, a loud conversation starting at the moment she settled into her breathing cycle, a boot scuffing gravel near her position during her sight picture. Nothing that could be formally documented. Everything that a person with bad intentions and good plausible deniability could deploy without consequence. Sarah scored 8 out of 10 at 500 meters. Drake had managed 7 in the same wind conditions with undamaged equipment and no interference. This arithmetic was not lost on him. The color in his face when he checked her score against his own was the color of a man whose certainty about the natural order of things has encountered contradicting information and has not yet decided how to process it. The response to contradicting information in Drake's experience was to increase pressure until the contradiction resolved itself. Briggs watched this from the scoring table. He wrote another note to himself. This one was longer than the first. The morning's vehicle for social pressure shifted at 8:30 when Drake organized what he called a friendly competition for the moving target evolution at 750 meters. The framing was inclusive. The underlying purpose was not. He made the challenge directly to Sarah. The specific wording he used belongs to the category of things that are technically inoffensive and structurally designed to create a situation where any response other than declining looks like the wrong kind of ambition, and declining looks like confirmation of what everyone already believes. She looked up from her rifle. "Term," she said. He blinked. The word was too short and too direct and had the quality of landing in the middle of a prepared speech and stopping it before it got where it was going. 5 targets, 30-second standard silhouettes, he said. Ladies first, he added. He had a smile he used for this specific type of situation. He used it now. Age before beauty, she said quietly. The laughter from the surrounding candidates was genuine and surprised and over before Drake had finished deciding how to respond to it. He set up with the theatrical confidence of a man performing for an audience he believes is entirely on his side. The targets moved at a moderate pace in a predictable lateral pattern. He fired rapidly, trusting his instincts and his equipment. 4 hits out of 5. He stood with his arms raised. "Beat that," he said. The smile again. Sergeant Marsh watched Sarah load her magazine for the evolution. He saw her pause, saw her hold one round, then another, weighing them in her fingers. He understood what she was doing. She had received a mixed magazine for this evolution, some rounds heavy match grade, some lighter training rounds. The weight differences would affect trajectory calculations significantly at this range, and the effect would compound across 5 sequential shots in a way that would make consistency nearly impossible for a shooter who had not identified the variation before the first round fired. She arranged them in a specific order before loading. Heaviest to lightest. Drake noticed this from his position. He leaned toward Harker and said something. Harker shook his head slightly, which was a response that Drake did not appear to register as significant. Sarah went prone, acquired the first target. Her body achieved a stillness that observers later described differently depending on their background and experience. The candidates who had not been around genuine operators described it as unnaturally still. The candidates who had been around genuine operators recognized it as the specific stillness that the body achieves when the conscious mind has cleared itself of everything that is not the task. She fired, hit center mass. She worked the bolt with mechanical economy, already tracking the second target before the brass from the first round had finished its arc to the concrete. Second shot, hit. By the third shot, the commentary from Drake's group had stopped. By the fourth, Drake's arms were no longer raised. When the fifth target fell, hit dead center, the range was quiet except for the distant metallic ring of steel on steel. Marsh checked his stopwatch. 22 seconds. 5 for 5 with mixed ammunition on a rifle she had been issued that morning in crosswind conditions that had caused Drake difficulty with superior equipment. "That's not possible," someone said from behind the firing line. The voice was genuinely puzzled, rather than dismissive, which was a different category of response. Marsh did not respond. He wrote in his notebook for a while. Then he watched Briggs at the scoring table, who had stopped making marks on his clipboard and was looking at Sarah with an expression that he had until this moment been careful not to display. The expression lasted for 2 seconds. Then the clipboard went back up. The marks resumed. Marsh had seen the expression. He wrote 3 more words. The shooting under duress test came at 10 o'clock. Candidates ran 400 meters in full gear, then had 60 seconds to engage targets, while their bodies were still demanding oxygen and their heart rates were still elevated. The point was heart rate. When the heart is running at 120 beats per minute, the rifle moves with the pulse, and every movement is amplified at distance into an error that costs accuracy. In an operational context, costs lives. Drake finished his run in 2 minutes 40 seconds. He went prone with his chest working visibly. The range safety officer announced his vitals. Heart rate 118. Respiratory rate 26. Drake took 90 seconds to get his breathing controlled enough to fire his first shot. The shot was good. He was a good shooter. Sarah ran 400 meters in 3 minutes 11 seconds, which was not a fast time. She came off the course and lowered herself to her firing position without the dramatic controlled fall that most candidates used. She settled in with the economy of someone sitting down to a task rather than recovering from an effort. The range safety officer moved to check her vitals. He checked them twice. Heart rate 47. Respiratory rate within normal resting range. He looked at his monitoring equipment the way Marsh had looked at the target at 100 meters, checking whether the instrument was producing accurate information or had developed a malfunction. She fired her first shot 28 seconds after finishing the run. She did not force anything. She waited the number of seconds it took her body to find its stillness and fired when the stillness arrived. The thing you have to understand about this level of physiological control is that it is not natural and it is not talent. Nobody is born able to drop their heart rate from sustained physical exertion to near resting levels in under 30 seconds. This is a skill built through years of systematic practice under the supervision of someone who understands the physiology and can identify and correct the errors in the development process. It is the kind of skill that leaves a specific signature in the person who possesses it. The signature says someone spent a great deal of time and care building this. Colonel James Callahan had spent a great deal of time and care building this. He had started building it when Sarah was 8 years old and had been refining it for 18 years because he believed that a person who could control their own physiology under stress could do things that people who could not control it could only read about. Drake, watching from the observer platform, pulled out his phone. He sent a text to a number he had not used in 4 months. 3 words. She's here. When? The response came back in under 2 minutes. It said, she'll know. He read the message twice. Put the phone away. Went back to watching the range with the expression of a man who has just had a thing confirmed that he believed was true and is in the process of understanding what the confirmation requires of him. At 11:30 during the equipment break, Drake cornered Sarah near the supply shed. He had been building toward a direct confrontation for several hours. The escalating indirection of the morning's interference had not produced the results he had anticipated. In his experience, sustained social pressure applied to a person who was genuinely out of their depth produced reliable results. The person began to make errors. The errors compounded. The compound errors eventually made visible what everyone had been suggesting, which was that the person had been wrong to think they belonged in this context. Sarah had not made errors. The barrel deviation, the mixed ammunition, the moving target evolution with mixed loads. Each situation that should have produced errors had instead produced evidence of adaptation so fluid that the adaptation was nearly invisible if you were not specifically looking for it. He came around the corner of the shed with Braddock and Culver flanking him at the specific distance that men establish when they want to be present as a physical argument without being directly accountable for the argument. He stood too close, used the 6 inches and 80 pounds he had on her as a primary statement rather than a secondary one. He talked about her gear, about her score, about what kind of program this was and who it was designed for. He had a line about accidents on ranges that he delivered with the ease of someone who has used it before and found it produces the intended effect. Her eyes did not go to his face. They went to the door of the shed, to the gap between Braddock and Culver, to the window on the east wall of the building. She was doing something that looked like not paying attention and was in fact the most attentive kind of behavior possible, which was the behavior of someone assessing a situation for all its components before responding to any of them. When she finally looked at him, he was mid-sentence. The quality of her attention stopped him. It was not what he had been looking for. There was no fear in it and no defiance. It was more like the quality of attention you get from someone who has already solved the problem you are presenting them and is waiting patiently for you to finish presenting it. He grabbed her right wrist. His thumb found the scar that ran from her wrist toward her elbow and pressed into the old tissue. Something changed in the room's temperature then. Not the room, the temperature of the space between them. 1 degree colder in a way that was specific and immediate. She looked at him for 2 full seconds. Then she said quietly and without inflection, "I need to clean my rifle." She said it the way you say something that is simply true and requires no additional support. Drake's hand released her wrist. The decision arrived in his fingers before it reached his conscious mind, which was the most unsettling part of it, looking back on it afterward. He had not decided to let go. His hand had simply let go. She walked back to the range without varying her pace. Stellan Rowe, watching from the corner of the adjacent building, had seen the entire exchange. He stood for a moment after she had gone, and Drake and the others had gone in the other direction, and he thought about his younger brother who had died at 19 from a hazing incident at a different base in a different program with different men who had used different words to describe the same fundamental activity. He thought about what it meant to watch something happen and tell yourself it was not your business. He had been telling himself that in all morning. He was becoming less satisfied with the telling. Gideon Marsh found Drake in the administration office at 11:45, closing the door behind him with the quiet deliberateness of a man who has information that requires a closed room. He set his notebook on the desk, opened it to the pages from the morning. He did not read from it. He knew what it said. 7 hits through a single hole on a bent barrel, Marsh said. She sorted the defective rounds by weight with her hands before she loaded. She measured the barrel deviation with her fingers before her first shot and held the correction through all 7 rounds. The 3 misses were keyholed bad powder loads she had identified and loaded last. He paused. Heart rate 47 after the 400-meter run. First shot at 28 seconds. 5 for 5 on the moving target evolution with mixed loads, 22 seconds. Drake was quiet. And at the supply shed just now, Marsh said. Drake had her against the wall, Braddock and Culver flanking. She cataloged all 3 exit routes before she looked at him. Drake picked up the notebook, looked at it for a moment. Set it down. The transfer paperwork, he said. It came through. Marsh had been waiting for this part. He'd requested it himself, sir. James Callahan submitted a transfer request for Marsh's current observer position 11 months before he died. Standard form, unremarkable in the filing. You wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it. Drake was very still. He knew Marsh would be here, Drake, he said. He positioned him here before he was sick enough that the Army would start reviewing his decisions. Marsh nodded, and he positioned the rifle and the access codes. Drake stood and went to the window and looked at the range where the afternoon evolutions were being prepared. He could see Sarah at Station 13 doing something methodical with her ammunition that he recognized as a final sort before the afternoon sequence. He built the whole thing, Drake said quietly, from a hospice bed in Raleigh. He knew she would come, and he made sure that when she came, she would find what she needed. He was quiet for a moment. Don't say anything, he told Marsh. Not yet. Keep watching. When tonight comes, you'll know what to do. Marsh picked up his notebook and left. Drake stood at the window for a long time after he was gone. At 12:45 during the lunch break, Stellan Rowe crossed the mess facility and sat down across from Sarah without announcing his intention to do so. She had seen him coming from the moment he stood up from the far table. She had watched his trajectory and the deliberateness of it and had made a preliminary assessment before he covered half the distance. She had decided he was not a threat. By the time he sat down, she had made the additional assessment that he was coming because he had something to say that was costing him something to say, which is different from a person who approaches because they want to be seen approaching. She waited. Listen, he said, tonight, the navigation exercise. They've set something up at the old bunker in Training Area 9. The checkpoint, 3, free location on your route. I know, she said. The 2 words stopped him completely. He had prepared for several possible responses. This was not among them. Then why are you going along with it, he said finally. She looked at him with the quality of attention that she had been deploying all day, the clean assessment that saw what it saw without adding or subtracting anything. Because Briggs needs to believe the plan is working, she said. If he thinks I'm contained tonight, he'll make his move. That's what I'm here for. Not the qualification. The move he makes when he thinks the threat has been neutralized. He stared at her. Who are you, he said. She considered him for a moment. Then she reached into her range bag and found a folded piece of paper and slid it across the table. If I'm not out of the bunker within 90 minutes, she said, take that to Sergeant Major Drake directly. Not Briggs, not Mason. Drake Abednego. He did not touch the paper. My father was James Callahan, she said. He instructed here for 19 years. He was investigating something before he died. I'm finishing it. The name landed the way that name tended to land at Fort Liberty, with the specific weight of a reputation that outlasts the person who built it. Rowe had heard the name in the preliminary orientation material for this program, referenced in the context of what the program's standards were and where they had come from and what they were intended to produce. He said something, Rowe said carefully. In the orientation brief for my cohort, not you by name. He said the best shot he'd ever trained wasn't a soldier. Said it like he was proud of it and didn't want to be caught being proud. She looked at the table, said nothing. Stay close to the main group tonight, she said. All of them. When it starts, you'll want witnesses who can account for Drake's group's location. And Briggs's. She stood and took her tray and left him sitting there with a folded piece of paper and the understanding that he was in the presence of something that had been in motion for a long time before this morning and would continue in motion long after tonight, regardless of what he chose to do. He picked up the paper, put it in his left chest pocket. He did not open it. At 1400, the advanced ballistics testing began. Candidates calculated complex shots accounting for wind elevation, humidity, barometric pressure, and for the candidates who had progressed past the standard curriculum, the Coriolis effect and spin drift at extreme range. Most candidates pulled out calculators and reference cards. The calculations were time-consuming and the variables were numerous, and the relationship between them was not linear, which meant that small errors in one variable compounded into significant errors in the final firing solution. Sarah wrote her solutions directly on the worksheet. No calculator, no reference materials. Clean rows of equations that included correction factors that Marsh recognized immediately as belonging to a curriculum that had not been included in any publicly available sniper training material. He watched her factor in the Magnus effect on spin drift, and he couldn't maintain the neutrality he had been maintaining all day. "Where did you learn that formula?" he said. She looked up. He saw the recognition of a mistake cross her face, brief and controlled. She had been making small, deliberate errors all day to maintain the performance of inexperience. This had not been a deliberate error. "A book," she said. "I read a lot." "What book?" Briggs asked from the scoring table, his voice, even his eyes on his clipboard. "I don't remember the title," she said. Her eyes went down to her worksheet. The room was quiet for a moment. The formula she had used included a correction factor that had been developed 3 years ago by SOCOM's Advanced Marksmanship Unit and distributed through a training pipeline that was not available to the general military population. No civilian book contained it. No publicly available military manual contained it. It existed in exactly one place, which was the classified advanced curriculum that James Callahan had been developing for the final years of his career based on research he had conducted in collaboration with SOCOM's technical division. Briggs wrote something long on his clipboard. The damage was done. She had revealed something she had not intended to reveal, and in the economy of this kind of work, revealed information changes the landscape in ways that cannot be undone. She knew this. She accepted it with the same flat practicality she had brought to every other piece of adverse information the day had produced. It was part of the cost of the operation. You paid it and continued. She completed her ballistics worksheet with deliberate errors inserted in the final 2 calculations, returned to the performance she had been maintaining, and waited for the afternoon to move towards evening. The vehicle handling exercise at 1600 was the most dangerous thing that happened before dark. Someone had cut her brake lines, not completely, enough to create a failure under sustained hydraulic pressure. The cut was on the rear line, positioned to hold through the early portions of the course and fail on the downhill sections where the brakes would be needed most urgently. Sarah's pre-operation vehicle check was thorough in a way that the issued checklist did not cover. She moved around the vehicle in a pattern that was tighter and more specific than the standard procedure, her hands moving over components in an order that suggested she had done this in conditions where missing something had consequences beyond a failing score. When her hands reached the brake line, they paused. 2 seconds. 3. Then she continued the inspection without changing her expression or her pace. She drove the course using engine compression on the downhill sections and the emergency brake for the 2 sharp turns that required hydraulic response. Her time was slower than the other candidates. From the observation area, this read as poor technique, hesitant, and inconsistent. Marsh, watching, wrote in his notebook. Doyle Harker was frowning at the timing board when the results were posted. He looked at Drake and said something in a low voice. Drake's response was dismissive. Harker did not look satisfied with it, but he said nothing further. Lieutenant Briggs near the timing station watched Sarah climb out of the vehicle. She rolled her left shoulder once a small mechanical movement and walked toward the equipment shed without looking back. He made a phone call, short. He turned away from the instructors on the platform while he made it. The call lasted 40 seconds. Drake at the far end of the vehicle bay watched Briggs make the call. He noted the time. He noted the direction Briggs turned. He noted which pocket Briggs put the phone in when the call was finished. He went to his office at 17:20 and opened the second drawer of his desk and took out a key and held it in his hand for a moment. Then he made a call of his own to the duty sergeant at Emergency Arms Room 7. The call lasted 90 seconds. It covered 3 specific items: an access code that would be valid for 12 hours, a weapon that needed to be confirmed in its current position, and a round count that needed to be prepared and ready. He put the key back in the drawer. Then he went to observe the start of the navigation exercise and waited. The navigation exercise began at 1800. 41 candidates spread across Training Area 9 with their maps and their compasses and their personal assessments of their own readiness. The training area covered 9 square kilometers of mixed terrain, old firebreak roads cutting through second-growth, pine-abandoned infrastructure from the 1960s that the Army had stopped maintaining and not gotten around to demolishing, and the specific kind of dark that accumulates in places that have been left alone long enough to stop feeling like places where people regularly go. Sarah carried the standard issued equipment and several items that were not on the issued list. Chemical lights still sealed, 40 feet of paracord, a short pry bar of the type used in electrical work acquired from the maintenance shed during the afternoon break, a monocular small enough to fit in a chest pocket that was not surplus store equipment, regardless of how it presented. She had been assembling these things throughout the day in the same way that she had been filing information throughout the day, quietly, specifically, without announcing the accumulation. She had the issued map, which she had memorized in 4 minutes, and folded into her left thigh pocket. She would not need to look at it again. Her assigned route went north to the first checkpoint, east along the old firebreak, and south through the interior of Training Area 9, passing Checkpoint 3 near the abandoned bunker complex that had been constructed in 1962, decommissioned in 1971, and left to develop its own particular kind of presence in the intervening decades. The route added nearly a kilometer to the most direct path and positioned her through the worst terrain at the worst hour. She accepted this as she had accepted everything else. Culver still had the Barrett M82 slung over his shoulder when the candidates dispersed. He had been carrying it since the checkpoint area staging, where Drake had arranged for Culver to take her rifle under the guise of a weight check that Briggs had authorized. It was one of several small arrangements that had been made throughout the afternoon, each one individually, unremarkable, collectively constituting a plan. Sarah had noted the moment the Barrett left her possession with the same flat attention she brought to everything. It had served its purpose, which was to show her the kind of people she was dealing with and confirm the kind of operation she was inside. She did not need it for what came next. What came next required something entirely different, and that something was already positioned and waiting in the northeast corner of the training area. She moved into the tree line and disappeared. Her footfalls made almost no sound. She moved parallel to her assigned route 15 meters into the tree line to the east of the marked path. The heel-first placement, the weight transfer, the center of gravity kept low and forward. This is slower than walking normally and quieter by a margin that matters enormously in the dark. She reached the approach to Checkpoint 3 at 1908, 11 minutes ahead of schedule. She used 7 of those minutes to climb a pine tree 50 meters from the bunker entrance. From that height through the monocular, she counted 4 figures near the bunker: Drake, Braddock, Culver, Harker. She swept the approaches twice and confirmed what she had calculated after her lunch conversation with Rowe. Stellan Rowe was not among the 4. He had listened. She noted the bunker door standing open in the way that things stand open when the opening is an invitation designed to look accidental. She noted the locking bar on the outside, a steel rod that dropped into 2 brackets. She assessed the thickness of the door from the hinge gap, which told her the weight and the steel composition and the age of the installation. She climbed down and approached Checkpoint 3 from the marked route, making the amount of noise that a person moving through unfamiliar terrain in darkness would naturally make. They came out of the shadow the way Drake had been practicing coming out of shadows for most of his adult life. Quickly, from multiple angles. Braddock took her arms from behind. Culver reached for her rifle and found only the sling from the Barrett M82, which he took anyway. Drake stepped in front of her. Checkpoint 3, she said. Using the wrong name, the small, deliberate error that would go into the report they were constructing about a confused candidate who had panicked in the dark. "You're checking in all right," Drake said. He had a smile for situations where he held every advantage. In there, he gestured toward the open bunker door. She allowed herself to be moved toward the entrance. Her eyes went to the locking mechanism one last time. The age of the installation. The design of the lock 1962 manufacture, which meant a generation of security thinking that had been superseded 3 times since then. Simple by the standards of anything built after a certain point. Addressable from the inside by a person who had the right tool and the knowledge to use it. She caught Drake's wrist as they pushed her through the door. 6 hours, she said quietly. You might want to stay together. All of you. What's that supposed to mean, he said. Just advice, she said. She stepped through into the dark. The door closed. The locking bar dropped into the brackets. She stood still and let the dark do what it could do, which was tell her about the space through what it carried. The dimensions from the echo of her own breathing, the age from the smell, the contents from the absence of certain sounds, 8 meters by 6 approximately, concrete on all surfaces, low ceiling, empty for a long time. She counted 60 seconds. Not from fear, from discipline. 60 seconds of stillness tells you more about a space than moving through it immediately. At 60 seconds, she reached into her range bag for the pry bar, into her breast pocket for the wire she had removed from the bag's frame during the lunch break and coiled flat. She worked in complete darkness with the economy of motion that her father had built into her hands through years of practice in conditions designed to make the hands remember rather than rely on the eyes. The lock mechanism was a 1962 design. She had reviewed the maintenance specifications for the bunker complex online 3 weeks ago before she arrived at Fort Liberty because this was exactly the kind of preparation that her father had taught her to make. The lock took 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The door swung inward. She stepped out into air that tasted clean by contrast. Drake and the others were 40 meters away, their voices carrying the specific confidence of men who believe the difficult part is behind them and the remaining part is administrative. She could hear the narrative taking shape in their conversation, the story they were going to tell. She had turned to find her path when the night changed. The sound arrived as pressure before it arrived as noise. Then the noise rolling across the training area from the direction of the main base with the frequency and resonance that is specific to ordnance and unlike anything designed to simulate it. Not a training charge. She stopped. The second explosion came 8 seconds later. Then the rhythm of automatic weapons fire. Not the controlled, deliberate cadence of a qualification range. The overlapping, urgent fire of a genuine engagement. A K pattern. She knew the sound the way she knew the sound of rain. Her father had made her study it when she was 15 because he believed in knowing the difference between what you were hearing and what you thought you were hearing. The bass sirens started their 3-tone cycle. Not a drill, multiple hostiles inside the wire. She turned back. Drake and his group had gone completely still. The self-congratulatory posture of the previous minutes was entirely gone. They were 3 kilometers from the main base. None of them were carrying live ammunition. The Barrett M82 that Culver had taken was loaded with the same mixed lots that Briggs had assigned that morning, and at this range, and in these circumstances, it was more liability than asset. The woman they had locked in a bunker 12 minutes ago was standing in front of them, with a lockpick still in her hand and the expression of a person who has moved past the situation you created for them and is now operating in a different context entirely. Status report, she said. Her voice had shifted register. Lower, the kind of voice that carries information rather than asking to be heard. Drake's radio crackled. He was holding it like he had forgotten it existed. 12 to 15 hostiles, the radio said. Sector 7, moving toward the ammunition depot. Base security engaged. Multiple casualties confirmed. She had already done the calculation. The ammunition depot in the northwest corner. Sector 7 on the northeast perimeter. If the hostiles reached the depot before a response team could interdict them, the secondary detonation would be catastrophic in every meaning of that word. She looked at Drake. Emergency Arms Room 7, she said. Training area boundary northeast corner. Follow me. She started walking and did not look back. They followed. All 4 of them. Without discussing it, without arguing, without the hierarchy of the morning asserting itself. She started walking in the dark with authority she had not claimed that morning, and they fell in behind her as if this were the arrangement that had always been planned. It was not the arrangement that had been planned, but it was the one that made sense. And in emergencies, the thing that makes sense tends to override everything that was planned before the emergency arrived. She walked through the dark of Training Area 9 toward the northeast boundary fence, and the sound of automatic weapons fire came and went on the wind, and the three-tone cycle of the base sirens continued their patient and urgent announcement. And behind her, the four men who had spent the day demonstrating their certainty about who they were and what they were capable of followed a 26-year-old woman through terrain they couldn't see toward a situation they hadn't trained for. She did not look back. She knew they were there. Part 2, Into the Trap, Bring the Hunter. The Emergency Arms Room 7 was a concrete building, roughly the dimensions of a two-car garage positioned at the boundary where Training Area 9 met the main installation. No sign, no visible indication of purpose beyond a keypad entry system and a camera mounted above the door. Specialist Greer was 22 years old and had been the duty sergeant for this room for 4 months and had never had a Code 77 Alpha activation in that time. He had been briefed on the code when he took the assignment. He had been told what it meant. He had filed the information in the part of his memory reserved for contingencies that were technically possible and practically unlikely. Drakey's call had come through at 17:35. It lasted 90 seconds. It told him 3 things: a code that would be activated tonight, a weapon to confirm in its current position, and the specific ammunition allocation to prepare. It told him these things in the plain direct language that the Drake used for all instructions, which was the language of someone who trusts the person he is instructing to understand what is required without additional explanation. Greer had pulled the container from storage and confirmed the serial number and placed it in the 3rd row, left side 3rd from the bottom. He had checked the combination lock. He had prepared the ammunition and placed it in the bottom of the container under a cloth 14 rounds of 338 Lapua Magnum from a specific lot number that Drakey had specified, which he had sourced from the main armory earlier that afternoon on a routine resupply request. He had been ready since 1800. When Sarah reached in the door at 2019, Greer was already moving before her hand reached the keypad. He had the expression of a man confirming an arrival he had been told to expect. She said the words anyway. Code 77 Alpha. He stepped aside. Protocol was protocol even when the preparation had already been completed. Especially then. The code was part of the record, and the record mattered. She went through the door and into the 3rd row and to the 3rd container from the bottom. She worked the combination with her right hand, 3 numbers that she had been given in a conversation 3 weeks before she died, or rather 3 weeks before the man who gave them to her died in a hospice room in Raleigh, with afternoon light coming through a window, and the particular quality of attention that a person devotes to the thing they know is the last important thing they will say. The container opened. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that smelled of gun oil and time, a Macmillan TAC 338, serial number JC004. She lifted it out. This rifle had been with her father for 11 years. It had been in the places that he had been, in the places that did not appear in any document that would ever be publicly released. It should have been processed out of inventory at the time of his death, sold or destroyed, according to the standard procedures that govern the dispersal of a soldier's personal property. Gideon Marsh had not allowed that to happen. He had moved it through the paperwork the way a careful man moves things through systems, with patience and technical knowledge and enough precision to make the trail difficult to find without enough carelessness to make it easy. He had done this 14 months ago at the same time that a transfer request bearing James Callahan's signature had been submitted through standard channels requesting Marsh's assignment to the Fort Liberty observer position. 2 pieces of a structure that James Callahan had been building from his hospital bed in the final months of his life, positioning assets in the places they needed to be for the operation that his daughter would run after he was gone. Drake had understood this when the transfer paperwork arrived. He had understood it completely and had not questioned it and had not made it known to anyone else, because understanding a thing that James Callahan had arranged meant trusting the arrangement and not explaining it to people who did not need to know. Sarah lifted JC-004, and her hands moved over it with a fluency that is not taught in any course. The check was thorough and fast, and performed with the complete certainty of someone who has done this thousands of times in conditions that required getting it right. 30 pounds of precision instrument, and she handled it as if its weight were already accounted for in her body's calculations, which it was, because she had been handling this rifle since she was 14 years old, and her body had been storing the information ever since. Drake stood behind her and watched her hands move. "That serial number," he said. His voice had lost its normal quality. There was something in it that was recognizing something it did not have a framework for. "That's Tier 1 equipment. That's personal." She loaded the magazine with the 14 rounds from the cloth in the bottom of the container. She sorted them by weight before loading even now. Especially now, because now was exactly the kind of moment where you did not shortcut the process because the consequences of shortcuts were no longer scored by an instructor. Stay here, she said. Guard the entrance. Confirmed friendlies only. She slung the rifle and walked out. Culver started to say something about her going alone. The door had already closed. His voice landed on empty air. The four of them looked at each other in the particular silence of men who have just been given an order by someone they spent all day dismissing and have in the space of the previous 10 minutes completely revised their understanding of the situation they are in. Drake sat down on a supply crate. He did not appear to have decided to sit down. His legs made the decision for him. Nobody said anything for a while. The approach to Building 31 covered 400 meters along the eastern fence line, then a section of parking area, then the maintenance road behind the administrative complex. She covered it in under 3 minutes, moving fast and low, and using the available cover with the automatic efficiency of a person for whom the assessment of cover has become a perceptual habit rather than a deliberate choice. It does not feel like a choice when it has been practiced long enough. It feels like seeing. The maintenance ladder on Building 31's north face went up 20 meters to a flat gravel roof. She went up one-handed with the rifle slung. This is not an easy thing to do, and she did not make it look easy. She made it look like a necessary thing being done by someone for whom necessary things take priority over ease. The roof was wet, gravel holding small collections of water between stones. She moved to the northeast corner, where the roofline gave maximum field of view across Sector 7 and the northwest corridor that led to the ammunition depot. She built her position in 19 seconds. No sandbags, no bipod. Her body, the rifle, and the gravel that she shaped with her free hand into a small depression to stabilize her left elbow. Her father had taught her to build positions from whatever the environment offered, because the environment at the moment of need never offers what the training environment offers. And a shooter who can only shoot from prepared positions is only useful in prepared situations. She found the enemy sniper first. He was on the roof of a storage facility, approximately 300 meters inside the wire, in a position that was well chosen and well concealed, and he had two of the base security response teams pinned in the open behind vehicles that were providing cover, but could not provide it indefinitely. She could see two men down in the open ground between the vehicles and the building, dark patches on the asphalt that were not going to get any lighter without medical intervention in the next few minutes. Nobody could reach them while the enemy sniper held his angle. She settled her cheek against the stock of her father's rifle. Distance 823 meters. Wind out of the southwest at 25 knots with gusts she had been tracking since she reached the roof, which had the 3-second cycle she had identified from the ground. Rain falling at a 12-degree angle. Temperature 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Target exposure approximately 4 centimeters of skull below the helmet line and above the collar of his vest. 4 centimeters at 823 meters in 25-knot crosswind in rain. Her father's voice from when she was 12 years old. The shot you think is impossible is usually a shot you haven't calculated correctly yet. Always calculate before you decide what's possible. She breathed. In for 7. Hold for 7. Out for 3. The rifle settled with her body into the specific stillness that is not the absence of movement, but the management of it. She could feel her own heartbeat in the stock. She timed the trigger brake to the pause between beats, the brief suspension when the heart is between states. She fired. The suppressed shot was quiet on the roof. 823 meters away, it was not quiet, but the man at the end of the trajectory did not experience it as sound. He was there, and then he was not. She was already moving before he finished falling. Rule 1. She could hear her father's voice as clearly as if he were on the roof beside her. You fired. Now move. The position you shot from is already a target, 6 meters east along the roofline. New position. She found the machine gun team in 9 seconds. They had been providing suppressing fire on the main gate, preventing the quick reaction force vehicles from entering the installation. The gunner was confident in his cover, which was excellent cover from the ground and considerably less so from above, and to the east, which was the direction from which no one had expected a threat to originate. Distance 791 meters. Temperature differential over the parking lot asphalt, creating a minor upwelling that required a 3-centimeter elevation correction. The correction arrived without being named or calculated consciously. It was simply part of what her hands and eyes did together, the accumulated product of 18 years of instruction and practice. She fired. The gunner dropped. The assistant gunner had 1 second to process what had happened. Her second shot ended his processing. She moved again. In the Fort Liberty Tactical Operations Center, Colonel Whitfield was watching the security camera feeds from Building 31's roof. The camera quality at this angle and distance was not exceptional. It showed a small figure moving across the rooftop in a pattern that his 30 years of experience recognized immediately as deliberate displacement, the systematic movement between positions that ensures no shot can be traced back to a fixed location. The pattern was not from any manual he had encountered. It was idiosyncratic in the way that a practice system becomes idiosyncratic, shaped by the specific experience of the person who developed it. Something about the rhythm was familiar in the way that something is familiar when you encountered it once, and it was significant enough to stay in memory, but you cannot immediately place it. "Get me Sergeant Major Drake," he said, "and pull the arms room log for emergency arms room 7. Last 60 minutes, the log came back in 40 seconds. Macmillan T, AC338, serial JC004, issued at 2019 via code 77 Alpha authorization." Whitfield looked at the serial number for a long time. J.C. James Callahan, personal weapon serial 4. Whitfield had known James Callahan for 9 years. Not intimately, well enough to understand that a weapon issued on his serial still in inventory 3 years after his death and activated tonight by a code that only a handful of people possessed was not a coincidence or an administrative error. He looked at the camera feed. The small figure had moved again, had acquired another target. The rhythm was the specific rhythm he had almost placed. "Get me everything you have on a course participant named Callahan," he said. Everything. Then he watched the roof and waited for the picture to complete itself. She had been on the roof for 9 minutes when she found their commander. He was in the tree line on the south edge of Sector 7, which was a good position except that she was not where he had expected any threat to be originating from, and his good position had been calculated for a different threat geometry. He was managing the retreat that had become necessary as his organized assault had been losing its organization since the moment his sniper stopped shooting. He was on his radio, demanding extraction in the specific tone of a man who arrived expecting one reality and has been meeting a different one at every decision point. 912 meters to the tree line. Extreme range for the rifle in these conditions. Rain increasing. Wind inconsistent, gusting to 30 knots on the 3-second cycle she had been tracking. She held her position and watched the wind for 40 seconds, counted the gusts, felt the pattern. Wind at this scale and over this terrain is not random. It has cycles and preferences, the tendency of air moving through a specific geography to repeat itself in ways that are predictable if you are patient enough to observe them before you need them. There, the pause. Approximately 2 seconds of relative stability every 17 seconds. She assembled the firing solution without writing anything down. Distance, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, the Coriolis effect at this latitude and this direction of fire, the spin drift of the round, at this range, the wind value based on the observed cycle, the temperature differential between the air at her position and the air at the tree line. All of it running through the system her father had built in her over 15 years of instruction, operating below the level of conscious thought the way a fluent speaker of a language does not consciously conjugate verbs. She waited for the 2-second pause. It came. She fired between heartbeats in the window between the wind's retreat and its return, and the round covered 912 meters in just over 1 second and arrived with enough energy remaining to end the conversation the commander was having at the precise midpoint of a sentence. The remaining hostiles ran. She tracked each one as they broke from their positions and moved for the tree line. She gave each enough time to commit to their direction to confirm they were not stopping or turning, and then she solved each one with the same economy she had brought to every shot before. No drama, no hesitation, simply the identification of a problem and the application of the solution that had been built into her hands and eyes over 18 years of practice. 12 targets, 12 solutions, 2 rounds remaining in the magazine. She safed the rifle. Sector 7, she said into the captured radio from the hostile she had disabled during her approach. Clear. Medical response needed east of the vehicle depot. 2 wounded, window closing fast. She held the rifle and listened to the base sirens continuing their cycle in the wet air above her. In the distance, the thump of helicopter rotors, the quick reaction force finally arriving. She had been on the roof for 13 minutes and 47 seconds. She kept the remaining 2 rounds. She had been keeping 2 rounds since she was 11 years old when her father had explained that you never spend everything you have, not in money and not in ammunition, and not impatience, because the moment you are empty is the moment the next problem arrives and you will want something left to address it with. She began the climb down. She was on the seventh rung from the bottom when she gripped the metal with her left hand and asked her left index finger to curl around it. It curled, but slowly, half a second behind the intention. The gap between the mind's instruction and the finger's compliance was small enough to be invisible to anyone watching, and large enough that she felt it completely, because she had a precise reference for what normal felt like in that hand, and this was not it. She finished the descent and stepped onto the ground, and her right hand went to the left shoulder without conscious direction, pressing against the entry point where a muzzle fragment had taken her during the displacement after the sixth shot. She had felt the impact. She had identified it as minor in the operational sense of the word, which is the sense of whether you can continue, and she had continued. The finger told her the impact had not been minor in a different sense. A base medic reached her from the direction of the vehicle depot kit over his shoulder, moving at the pace of a man who has been running towards sounds that required his particular skill set for the past 15 minutes. She let him approach. She held JC-004 in her right hand, pointed at the ground, and waited for the medical assessment with the same flat practicality she had brought to every other piece of information the day had offered. The medic worked efficiently. He told her the fragment was out, the wound was clean, the field dressing would hold until the medical bay. He told her she needed imaging to rule out deeper involvement and that a physician would need to evaluate the extent of any nerve involvement. She said she understood. She had already felt what the imaging would confirm. The finger had told her when she gripped the rung. She had not finished deciding what to do with the information yet, which was separate from receiving it. She received information when it arrived. She decided what it required of her on her own schedule. The medic walked with her toward Emergency Arms Room 7. She carried J-004 in her right hand and did not look at her left hand and thought about the things she needed to do in the next hour that still needed doing. Stellan Rowe had been in position near the main administrative building's parking area since 2030, having moved from the main group of navigation exercise candidates when the base siren started and the situation became what it was. He had understood without being told that this was the moment Sarah had been describing at lunch when she said Briggs would make his move when he believed the threat was contained. He had the folded piece of paper in his left chest pocket. He had not opened it. He had taken it to mean what she had told him it meant, which was a fail-safe for a situation where she did not emerge from the bunker. She had emerged from the bunker, but the paper had told him one other thing without being open, which was that she had prepared for this moment, and preparation of this kind implied that the parking area near the administrative building was a location worth watching. He was watching it when Briggs came at 20:54. Briggs was moving at the pace of a man who wants to cover distance quickly without appearing to be running. He had his phone to his ear. He was speaking in a low, controlled voice. He was not looking behind him, which was a specific kind of not looking that Rowe recognized from the morning's observation of how Briggs conducted himself, the careful performance of a man who has been managing appearances for so long that the performance has become automatic. It stopped being automatic at the moment Rowe stepped into his path. Briggs attempted to move around him. Rowe adjusted. Briggs deployed the authority of rank in the tone he had used for 6 years to make people step back. Rowe looked at him with the expression of a man who has recently undergone a fundamental revision of which authorities are legitimate and which are performances that benefit only the performer. What happened next took 4 seconds. It used a technique from a hand-to-hand instructor who had spent 2 months at Fort Liberty the previous year and had believed in repetition over theory. Rowe had done the repetitions. Briggs went down. Nora Kellum was 12 feet away with her phone recording. She had been there before Rowe arrived positioned where she was because Rowe had told her specifically where to be and what to do and had been very clear about the one thing, which was, do not move the camera. She did not move it. Briggs spoke for 4 minutes with his face against the wet asphalt and Rowe's weight on his arms and the understanding arriving in him at the pace that understanding arrives when the architecture has not merely failed but collapsed completely and there is nothing left to protect and no version of this situation that doesn't end the same way. He gave them names, 14 of them. He gave them contact protocols and payment structures and the communication methods he had used for 6 years to pass the identifying information of James Callahan's best graduates to a network that had been in operation since before Callahan started noticing the mortality rates. Rowe said nothing throughout. He held the position and let Briggs speak and trusted that the phone in Nora Kellum's hands was capturing everything accurately. MPs arrived at 21:09. Briggs was in custody at 21:11. He had recognized by then that he had already said everything that could be used against him, which did not improve his situation in any way, but did mean he stopped adding to it. Rose stood and straightened his uniform. He looked at Nora. "Did you get all of it?" he said. "All of it," she said. He nodded once. She closed the phone. They stood in the parking lot for a moment in the rain that was still coming down, and then they both moved toward the administrative building because there were people in audit who needed to know what had just happened. Sarah returned JC-004 to Specialist Greer at 2051. She signed the return form with her right hand. 14 rounds issued. 2 returned unfired. 12 expended. The signature was clean and showed no tremor. "Tell Colonel Whitfield's office to request the full log." "When they call," she said, "everything. Issuance time, authorization code, round count, all of it." Greer said he would. He said ma'am again. He had decided it was appropriate, regardless of what her actual rank turned out to be. She walked out into the rain and moved toward the administrative building. The base was in the specific controlled activity that follows a genuine security event. Emergency vehicles moving in purposeful patterns. Personnel accounting for themselves and their equipment. The sounds of a structure that has been stressed and is in the process of determining its own damage. She moved through it with the quality of someone who has been in enough post-event environments to know which way the current moves and how to move with it rather than against it. She had things to do. The night was not finished. Colonel Whitfield's office at 2130 was occupied beyond its comfortable capacity, which was appropriate for the weight of what was being addressed. Whitfield behind his desk. Captain Dana Holt from Internal Affairs to his left with a recording device running and a notepad in active use because she was thorough in the way that made her valuable and occasionally difficult to be in the same room with. Sergeant Major Aldous Drake near the window, standing the expression of a man who has been holding a significant amount of information in a patient and organized manner and is now in the process of allowing it to be distributed to the appropriate recipients. Gideon Marsh against the far wall quiet, having arrived 4 minutes after the meeting began in response to a text from Drakey. Sarah came in last. She had changed into dry ACS retrieved from her vehicle. Her left shoulder carried a field dressing under the fabric. She moved to the chair across from Whitfield and sat without being invited, and the absence of the invitation's necessity was understood by everyone in the room. Whitfield set the arms room log on the desk. The serial number JC-004 visible at the top of the page. He said her name, her full name with the surname that connected everything. She met his eyes. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Not in the order that the events had occurred, but in the order that was useful for a person who needed to understand what had been built, and why, and what had been accomplished tonight, and what remained to be done. Briggs's access to graduate deployment data. The mortality pattern. Her father's investigation. The 18 months she had spent continuing it from outside the official structure, which was the only structure available to her once she understood that the official structure had a point of compromise. She put the thumb drive on the desk. James Callahan's documentation plus 18 months of her own work, organized for the person who would need to act on it. "How long have you been planning this specifically?" Whitfield said. She looked at the window. The rain was still falling. "My father made a list of the approaches that would give me access to what I needed." She said, "This program was at the top. He wrote the list 8 months before he died and spent 2 months revising it." Holt's pen had been moving without stopping since Sarah sat down. Drake was still. Then Holt set a printed sheet on the desk between them without comment or introduction. She had been working through the personnel files while they talked with the methodical thoroughness that made her useful and had led to her current role. The sheet was a transfer request. Fort Liberty Sniper School observer position. The name of the person being transferred was Gideon Marsh. The originating authorization bore a signature at the bottom. James Callahan's signature. Dated 11 months before he died. Whitfield looked at the document, then at Drake, then back at the document. He arranged it, Whitfield said, the transfer. He positioned Marsh here in this observer role before he was sick enough that the Army would start reviewing his judgment. He looked at Sarah. He moved Marsh into position. He said, slowly working through it aloud the way a person works through a thing they need to hear themselves say. He preserved the weapon in inventory. He gave you the access codes and the name. He placed the support structure before he died and left it waiting for you to arrive. She said, I knew what he told me. I didn't know about the transfer request until just now. She paused. He planned for contingencies I didn't have, she said. That was his method, always thinking 3 positions ahead. The room was quiet with the specific weight of a room in which something important has just been fully understood. Whitfield thought about a man spending the last productive months of his life not resting, not making peace with the world in the conventional sense, but building a mission architecture around his daughter so that when she came to finish what he had started, she would not be walking in unsupported, not leaving her alone with it, still instructing, still thinking ahead, still covering her approach from a hospice bed in Raleigh, because that was what James Callahan did and who he was, and the dying had not changed it. Drake spoke from the window for the first time since Sarah had entered the room. He was the best instructor I ever had, he said. He was also the most patient man I ever encountered. He looked at Sarah across the room. He would have been satisfied with tonight. It was not a compliment in the conventional sense. It was something more specific. The acknowledgement that a standard has been met, from a man trained by the person who set the standard. Sarah was quiet for a moment. He would have found 3 things to correct, she said. Drake looked at her. Something passed across his face. That's true, he said. He would have. Whitfield let the moment be what it was and then returned to what remained. The course. Your status. Failed psychological evaluation, she said. Unstable. Possibly delusional. Recommend discharge with mental health referral. He looked at her. She looked back with the same quality of attention she had maintained through everything. The quality that saw what it saw and processed it cleanly and waited for the appropriate response. That's your recommendation, he said. The people who arranged tonight will know the network is compromised within 72 hours, she said. They need a story about how. The story cannot be a course participant named Callahan who appeared and disappeared and left a trail that connects back to her father's investigation. The story needs to be an unstable candidate who washed out and has no coherent account of the evening. Holt stopped writing. You're asking us to document a false evaluation, Holt said. I'm telling you what operational security requires, Sarah said. The documentation is your decision. Holt and Whitfield looked at each other across the desk in the way of 2 people who are about to make a decision that is professionally complicated and operationally necessary, and are acknowledging both of those facts simultaneously. Whitfield picked up the thumb drive. Get me the legal officer, he said to Holt. Tonight. You have good people here, Sarah said. Trust them. Give them the right culture and the right standards, and they will do what they were trained to do. She stood. Don't let the next Briggs spend 6 years undetected. Look at the numbers. Notice when the numbers don't add up. She walked to the door, stopped. My father's rifle, she said. JC-004. The duty sergeant has the paperwork. Yes, he should keep it, she said. He earned it. She walked out. Part 3. Phantom Watch. The medical bay was in the south wing of the main administrative building, 3 rooms with 6 beds between them, staffed overnight by a duty nurse and a physician's assistant named Decker, who had 12 years of military medical experience, distributed across enough different contexts that he was genuinely difficult to surprise. Tonight had not surprised him exactly, but it had made him attentive in a way that the routine nights did not. Sarah arrived at 2210, directed there by Whitfield's aide after the meeting in the colonel's office. The field dressing on her left shoulder was adequate for its original purpose and not adequate as a medical endpoint. There were forms, there was imaging to complete, there was the evaluation that the injury required. She submitted to this process with the patience she brought to processes that were necessary and uninteresting, which was a category of patience she had developed to a high level. Decker cleaned the wound, examined the entry site, reviewed the imaging when it came back from the technician, and told her what the imaging confirmed. He told her with the directness that he considered a professional obligation. Softening information because it was difficult to hear was a kindness he had stopped offering years ago, because in his experience, it did not reduce the difficulty and simply delayed the point at which the person could begin working with the truth. The fragment had been small. The damage to the tissue surrounding the radial nerve branch that governed fine motor control of the left index finger was not catastrophic. She would retain full use of the hand. The gross motor function would be unimpaired. But the index finger's precision control would not recover to its previous baseline. Nerve tissue of this type does not regenerate in the way that other tissue regenerates. With specific and sustained therapeutic work, the function would improve from its current level and would eventually stabilize at a ceiling that was measurably below where it had been before the injury. For most people and most purposes, the difference would be negligible. For precision shooting at distance, it was not negligible. The relationship between trigger finger and firing solution is specific in the way that very few things are specific. The margin for error at the ranges she had been operating at tonight was measured in fractions of a millimeter. The lag she had felt on the 7th rung of the ladder, the half-second gap between intention and compliance, would improve marginally and then stop improving. She would not fire at that level again. She received this information the way she received all information, cleanly, without adding to it or subtracting from it. She asked two questions, both technical, both about the realistic range of functional improvement with the specific therapeutic protocols Decker was recommending. He answered them precisely. She thanked him. Then she lay back on the treatment bed and looked at the ceiling and was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, Fort Liberty in the early morning hours was doing what installations do after significant events. Activity without urgency. The emergency over the accounting begun. Reports being filed. Personnel accounting for their positions and their decisions. The slow institutional process of understanding what had happened and what it meant and what it required. She looked at her left hand in the dim light of the medical bay. The index finger at the angle it held when unforced slightly different from the others, the small visible evidence of what the fragment had done. Her father had told her many things over many years. The specific instruction that arrived in her memory in the quiet of the medical bay was one he had given when she was 17, after she failed a qualification that she had believed she would pass. He had not consoled her, and he had not minimized the failure. He had said the finger points at the moon. The finger is not the moon. Know the difference between the tool and the purpose. The purpose was not shooting. The purpose was what shooting served. She had spent 18 months serving the purpose with the specific tool that shooting represented. The tool was now modified, permanently. The purpose had not changed. She thought about this for a while in the way that she thought about difficult things, which was carefully and without forcing a resolution before the resolution was available. She did not have the answer for what came next. She gave herself the space not to have it yet. She looked at the ceiling and waited for morning. Drake came at 6 o'clock. The base had found its working rhythm, by then the rhythm of an institution that has processed a significant event and is running the consequences through its systems. The sun had not risen yet, but the sky to the east had begun its preliminary announcement of intention, the specific gray that precedes color. He moved through the administrative complex with the unhurried pace of a man who has been through enough significant nights to understand that the morning after always arrives and always makes the same demands. You show up. You do what the day requires. You do not let the weight of the previous night prevent you from being present for the current morning. He stopped in the doorway of Sarah's room. She was sitting up in the bed, the left arm in a temporary sling. The look of someone who had been awake for some time and had been using the time for something other than rest. He came in without knocking. He pulled the room's single chair to the side of the bed and sat in it with the deliberateness of a man who has prepared what he intends to do and is doing it as prepared. He did not say anything about the previous evening. He did not mention 12 kills or the roof of Building 31 or JC-004 or any of the things that would eventually be described in various reports with various levels of classification. He did not offer the consolation or the acknowledgement that the situation might seem to call for. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out an envelope. The kind of an envelope that photographs come in when someone has been careful enough to give a photograph proper protection. He set it on the table beside the bed. "Your father gave me this in 1988, he said. He said, keep it somewhere you won't lose it. He said he had a reason he'd explain later." He paused. He never explained it later. Drake said, "But I kept it." She picked up the envelope with her right hand, opened it with the careful one-handed precision of someone who has learned to manage with the hand available. Inside was a photograph, black and white, the paper slightly yellowed at the corners in the way of photographs that have been in envelopes for a long time and traveled to many places. Two men at a range. Fort Bragg identifiable from the architecture visible at the frame's edge. The taller man on the left was her father, young enough that she had to look at him twice to be certain, though the posture was unmistakable from the first glance. The shorter man on the right was Drake, 20 years old or close to it, his face carrying the specific expression of a young man and the sustained presence of an instructor he respects in the way that changes the rest of his professional life. Both of them were looking down the range through their scopes. The photograph had been taken from slightly above and to the side by someone who understood that the important thing to record was the posture rather than the face, the left elbow placement, the right hand's position against the stock, the line from shoulder through the neck to the cheek, the same line that Building 31's security camera had recorded on the roof in the rain. She looked at the photograph for a long time. "He talked about you in every class, Drake," he said. "Not by name. He said the best shot he'd ever produced wasn't a soldier and had steadier hands than him by the time she was 12. He stopped. The men in my classes spent years trying to figure out who he was talking about, Drake said. She looked up from the photograph. Something had shifted in her face. The quality of assessment that she had been maintaining through everything had found its resting point, and what was underneath it was not soft, but it was human, and it was visible. He stood. He did not offer his hand. He did not make a speech. He looked at her for a moment with the eyes of a man who has been holding something for a longest time and has just placed it in the correct location after a long period of carrying it. Then he turned and walked out of the room. She looked at the photograph. The taller man on the left. His elbow. His shoulder. The line from shoulder to cheek. The same line. She placed the photograph on the blanket in front of her and looked at it and let herself feel the full weight of what it contained, which was 37 years and a man she would not stop missing, and the evidence that the missing was mutual and that it had been expressed in the specific language that James Callahan used for the things that mattered most to him, which was the language of preparation and patience and building something that would outlast the builder. Stellan Rowe found Nora Kellum in the cafeteria at 7:30. She was eating with the focused attention of someone who has been awake all night and is using the act of eating to organize her thoughts. He sat across from her with coffee. They talked about the events of the previous evening, the portions that could be discussed in a cafeteria, and then they were quiet. She set her fork down. How many rounds did she fire? Nora said. 14, Rose said. 12 hits, 2 returned. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her fork again. She ate for a while without saying anything else. Rowe recognized the expression she was wearing as the expression she wore when she was processing something, rather than when she was finished processing it, and he waited. Nora Kellum had a habit that her family considered excessive and her instructors found professionally useful. She read everything that was available to read. Not selectively, comprehensively. Course materials, historical records program, documentation, the supplementary archives that most candidates filed away without opening because the primary materials were already demanding enough. She had read the full historical record for Fort Liberty's sniper program because the record was available and she was Nora Kellum. She went to the barracks at 7:45 and opened the file on her phone and searched for James Callahan. The standard record, 34 years. Program development training lineage, the appropriately sparse official documentation of a man whose career had operated in the parts of his profession that do not generate extensive records. Near the end of the file, a paragraph added by a records clerk during a consolidation in 2019, referencing an informal historical notation from August 1991. Kuwait, a convoy engagement. She read it twice. Then she sat still for a moment with the phone in her hands. James Callahan had fired 14 rounds in 14 minutes. 14 kills. A convoy ambushed in terrain that provided no cover had survived because a man with a rifle placed himself between the threat and his people and fired until the threat was resolved. The notation was informal. Never entered into any citation, never referenced in any public record. The kind of thing that exists in archives because someone thought it should be recorded somewhere, even if it was never going to be announced anywhere. 14 rounds. She thought about the arms room log that Rowe had been shown as part of the custody witness process. 14 rounds issued, 12 expended, 2 returned. She thought about the figure on Building 31's roof that everyone was describing in the careful language of people who have been told not to discuss something directly. The duration, the outcome. She closed the file. She kept what she had found for several hours, turning it over in her mind, determining the right time and the right way to deliver it. Not in the cafeteria, not in passing, when the person could receive it without other things competing for the same moment. At 10:15, she knocked on the frame of the medical bay doorway. Sarah was sitting up in the bed, her left arm in its sling, the photograph from Drake on the blanket in front of her. She looked up. Nora came in and sat in the chair. She told Sarah what she had found in the historical record. Not softened, not elaborated, just the facts as she had found them. 14 rounds. Kuwait, August 1991. 14 minutes. She said, I thought you should know. Sarah looked at her left hand, the index finger at its resting angle. She had fired 14 rounds without counting them, without knowing the number had any significance. She had fired until the problem was resolved as the training required. She had stopped with 2 remaining as the principle required. The number that resulted from those 2 requirements combined was 14, and she had not known until this moment that the number meant anything beyond the arithmetic. Some things you inherit without knowing what you are inheriting until you see what was given. She thanked Nora. Nora nodded once and left. Sarah looked at the photograph on the blanket. Her father at the range, 1988, looking down a scope with the posture she had not learned from any manual because she had learned it from standing next to him when she was 8 years old, and watching and listening and internalizing until the watching and listening became unnecessary because the knowledge had moved into her hands. She had not planned the number. She had not been trying to match anything. She had simply done what he had taught her to do in the way that he had taught her to do it, and the number that resulted was the same number that had resulted when he did it 30 years ago in Kuwait. The finger points at the moon. The finger is not the moon. She understood the distinction now in a way that she had understood it intellectually before, but not fully yet, in the way that full understanding requires. The shooting was a skill. The skill had a cost. The cost was real and permanent, and she was not going to pretend it was anything less than what it was. But the skill was not the purpose. The purpose was the thing the skill served. 3 of her father's students had been identified and killed through information that Briggs had sold. Briggs was in custody. 14 names were being processed. The network that James Callahan had spent the last year of his health trying to identify was now known to the people in the positions to dismantle it. That was the purpose. She looked at her left hand for a long time. Then she looked at the photograph. Then out the window where Fort Liberty in the early morning is simply present. The ranges and buildings and tree lines doing what they did in the light being exactly what they were. She reached up and placed the photograph in the breast pocket of her uniform jacket, the left chest pocket over her heart. The envelope fit there as if the pocket had been designed for it, which in some sense it had been the photograph traveling through 37 years and however many inside pockets to arrive here. She swung her legs off the bed, her left arm in its sling, her right hand steadying her as she stood. She took a breath and made the assessment she always made in the morning, working upward from her feet. Available everything that had always been available. The patience, the precision, the accumulated product of 18 years of instruction from a man who had understood what he was building and had built it with the kind of care that does not announce itself, requiring management a shoulder that would heal, a finger that would stabilize at a new level, a phone call to Raleigh that was 18 hours overdue. She found her boots and put them on one-handed, tightened the left one, the right one. She stood. Whitfield was in his office when she knocked on the open door at 8:30. He looked up from the documents that had been accumulating on his desk since before midnight and that showed no sign of stopping their accumulation. She sat across from him without preamble. "There's a matter I should have raised last night," she said. He waited. "The Barrett M82 that was issued to me at the start of qualification. Drake's group took it at checkpoint 3 during the navigation exercise. It should be in Culver's possession or nearby. It needs to be returned to inventory with a full incident report documenting the circumstances of its removal from my possession." He looked at her for a moment. "Culver had it when he arrived at the arms room last night," she said. "I expect it's still there. Specialist Greer would know." She stood. "The incident report will document several things that Briggs authorized during the day," she said. "The ammunition assignment, the position assignment, the vehicle maintenance situation. All of it is relevant to the case." She walked to the door. He called her name. She stopped. He said, "For the record, what you did last night, what you built over 18 months, what your father built before he died." He stopped. He was not a man who made speeches. He was a man who said the necessary thing and stopped, and the necessary thing was often brief. "It should be recognized," he said. She stood in the doorway for a moment. "I'm not looking for recognition," she said. "I'm looking for the network to be dismantled so that the next Callahan graduates don't die in ambushes that were arranged from a desk in Fort Liberty." She left. Whitfield sat in his office with the documents and the morning light and the understanding that he had just spoken with someone who occupied a category he did not encounter often, which was the category of people who are exactly who they need to be without being anything more or anything less, and who are so clear about what they are there to do that everything else, including what they are owed, becomes peripheral information. He picked up his phone. He had calls to make. At 9 o'clock, Drake assembled what remained of the qualified candidates in the main briefing room. Drake was there without rank insignia, the reduction to private having been processed at 0500 by a duty officer who had received clear instructions. Braddock and Harker sat to his right. Culver was absent, having been separated from the course. Stellan Rose sat in the front row, his posture the posture of a man who is present and attentive. Nora Kellum was there at Drake's specific request. Drake stood at the front of the room. "Last night," he said, "this installation was attacked by a coordinated hostile force that had prior knowledge of our patrol routes. our response timelines, and the identities of personnel who were in a position to respond. That prior knowledge came from inside this program. He let that land. Lieutenant Briggs is in custody. He will be processed through the appropriate channels. 14 other names were provided in his initial statement and are being actioned as of this morning. He looked at the people in the room. 3 soldiers who graduated from this program in the past 4 years are dead because their identities were sold. They were killed in engagements that were designed around the information Briggs provided. Their families were told they died in unexpected enemy contact. That phrase covered the truth because the truth required an investigation that is now complete. He paused. There was a course participant here this week who came to complete that investigation. She identified the final piece of evidence that made the case actionable. She responded to a live hostile threat on this installation with 14 rounds and 12 confirmed kills in 13 minutes and 47 seconds, using equipment that had been deliberately degraded throughout the day by the people responsible for her equipment. He looked at Drake. She also survived a day of sustained interference from people in this room that included sabotaged equipment, physical intimidation, and false imprisonment. Drake did not look up. That interference, Drakey said, was part of what Briggs was counting on. He selected the members of his informal harassment team specifically for their predictability. He knew how you would behave, and he used your behavior as operational cover for what he was doing. He let that land as well. The purpose of telling you this, he said, is not to shame you. The purpose is to make clear that the way you conduct yourselves in this program is not a matter of personal preference or unit culture. It is an operational security matter. A toxic environment creates blind spots. Blind spots are exploited by people like Briggs. The connection is direct, and the cost has been demonstrated. He looked at Rowe. Specialist Rowe acted with moral courage and tactical clarity under conditions that did not make doing so easy. His actions last night, including the detention of Lieutenant Briggs and the preservation of evidence, were decisive. He will be recommended for accelerated advancement. He looked at Nora Kellum. Candidate Kellum will be recommended for advanced sniper qualification track based on demonstrated performance and judgment throughout the qualification period. He came back to Drake. Private Drake will complete a 6-month period of remedial instruction in leadership fundamentals under my direct supervision. At the end of that period, his performance will be evaluated, and his path forward will be determined by what that evaluation shows. He moved behind the podium and picked up a file folder. The program resumes at 1300 hours, he said, modified schedule accounting for the events of last night. Questions will be answered as appropriate. Dismissed. The room began to empty. Drake was the last one standing. He stood at his chair for a moment with the expression of a man working through something that is not comfortable to work through. Drake was at the podium reviewing the folder. Sir Drake said. Drakey looked up. The woman. Callahan. Drakey said nothing. She knew all day, Drake said. What we were doing. She knew about the bunker before we set it up. Drakey closed the folder. She did, he said. Drake was quiet for a moment. She let it happen anyway. Yes. Why? Because she needed Briggs to believe the plan was working, Drakey said. If he thought she was neutralized, he would activate the attack. If he activated the attack, she would have what she needed to end the investigation. She needed the bunker to happen. You provided it. He picked up the folder. You were predictable, he said, in the way that Briggs counted on. The question going forward is whether you're willing to become unpredictable in the right direction. He walked past Drake toward the door. That's what the next 6 months are for, he said. Don't waste them. He left. Drake stood alone in the briefing room for a while. At 11, Sarah called her mother. Margaret Callahan answered on the second ring, which was the number of rings it typically took her when she had been waiting for the call. They talked for 37 minutes. Sarah did not explain most of what had happened. She said there had been an incident at the base, that she had been involved, that she had a shoulder injury that was healing and was not serious. She said the thing she had come to do was done. Her mother was quiet for a moment after that. He knew you'd finish it, Margaret said. He said that to me. Not that you would try, that you would finish it. Sarah said nothing for a moment. I'm coming home at the end of the week, she said. A few days to process out. Good, her mother said. The hydrangeas need cutting. This was Margaret Callahan's version of emotional expression, which was to return to the concrete and the specific and the manageable after the large thing had been acknowledged. It was a quality she shared with her husband and had passed to her daughter in the way that qualities pass, not through instruction, but through proximity. Sarah said she would help with the hydrangeas. She ended the call and held the phone for a moment. Then she went back inside to complete the process out paperwork because the paperwork required completion and incomplete things left in official systems created complications that sometimes found the people who created them years later. The formal inquiry into the previous night's events began at 1300 under Captain Holt's direction. It ran in closed session for 4 days. The findings were classified at the appropriate level. What can be said about the findings is that they were thorough and their implementation was efficient, which was a reflection of both Holt's professionalism and the quality of the documentation that had been prepared for the moment when documentation would be needed. Briggs was processed through the military justice system over the following 4 months. His testimony identified 14 individuals across 3 installations and 2 federal agencies. Each identification led to an investigation. Each investigation produced outcomes that did not generate press releases or congressional testimony or any of the public acknowledgments that some cases produce. They simply produced outcomes, which was what the families of 3 dead soldiers and the graduates of James Callahan's program deserved. The network that had been operating for 6 years stopped operating. The 3 men whose deaths had set James Callahan's investigation in motion received revised casualty reports within 8 months. The revisions did not restore what had been taken from their families. They provided something that was not the same as restoration and was still necessary, which was the truth about how the men had died and the acknowledgement that they had not simply encountered bad luck. Their families were not told all of it. They were told enough. In the months that followed, the Fort Liberty Sniper Program underwent the kind of institutional change that tends to happen when the factors that enabled a significant failure have been clearly identified and the people responsible for addressing them take their responsibility seriously. The culture shifted, not dramatically and not immediately, because culture does not shift dramatically and immediately in any institution that has been operating long enough to have a culture. But it shifted in the direction that cultures shift when the people at the top of them understand what direction is necessary and are willing to do the sustained work of moving it. Enhanced screening protocols, revised security procedures for graduate deployment information, a systematic review of the relationships between instructor access and the operational data that instructors could reach. The specific vulnerabilities that Briggs had exploited addressed specifically and then reviewed for analogous vulnerabilities that might be exploited differently. Drake supervised all of this personally in addition to supervising Drake's remedial period and teaching 2 sections of the advanced qualification course and doing the administrative work that his role required. He slept less than was probably advisable and worked more hours than anyone tracked him working because he had understood James Callahan's instruction about finishing what was started, and he applied it to his own work as consistently as he had ever applied any instruction. Drake's remedial period was difficult in the specific ways that useful periods of difficulty tend to be difficult. He was not broken by it. He was changed by it, which is the better outcome. He discovered over the 6 months that the qualities that had made him a problem in this context were qualities that had legitimate applications in other contexts, and that the difference between a person who uses their aggression to dominate the people around them and a person who uses it to protect the people around them is less about the aggression itself than about the direction it is pointed. He graduated from remedial status at month 7, 3 weeks ahead of schedule, based on Drakey's assessment that the evaluation criteria had been met. He did not thank Drake for the program. He thanked him for the honesty of it, which was a more specific and more accurate form of gratitude, and which Drake accepted with the brief nod he used for acknowledgments that did not require elaboration. Stellan Rowe moved through the fast-track path that Drakey had opened for him with the combination of ability and judgment that had defined his actions on the night of the attack. His Ranger evaluation came back with a notation from the panel that his ability to make independent decisions under high-pressure conditions was exceptional and should be developed further. He kept the folded piece of paper in his left chest pocket through his entire time in the program. He did not explain it to people who asked. He said it was personal. It was. Nora Kellum broke 3 qualification records in 4 months. She occasionally had the sense during the most difficult shots of being observed by someone checking her form against a standard that had not been formally taught to her. The sense was not unpleasant. It was the sense of accountability that has no specific source, which is the kind of accountability that changes people in ways that accountable people tend to need to be changed. Sarah Callahan drove out of Fort Liberty on a Thursday morning in November, 7 days after she had arrived. The Honda Civic started on the 3rd attempt, which was an improvement on recent performance, and it carried her south toward Raleigh through the particular quality of morning that November provides in North Carolina, which is cold and clear and definite in a way that September and October are not yet definite. She drove with her right hand on the wheel. Her left arm was out of the sling now and rested in her lap. She flexed the index finger at intervals during the drive. The exercise Decker had prescribed the movements slow and deliberate and slightly behind the intention, in the way that the movements would continue to be slightly behind the intention for as long as they were what they were. She thought about what came next. The answer to that question was not complete, and she was not forcing it to be complete before it was ready. She knew some things. She knew that the skills her father had given her were not only the skill of precision shooting, though that was the most visible one, and the one that the past week had required most directly. They were the skills of observation and patience, and the ability to carry significant amounts of information in an organized and usable form while operating in conditions designed to prevent clear thinking. These were transferable. They were not diminished by what had happened to her left index finger. She knew that there was more work. The network Briggs had fed was one network among others, and the conditions that allowed it to exist in one place allowed similar structures to exist in other places, and the work of finding and dismantling those structures was ongoing and required people who understood how to do it and were willing to pay the cost of doing it. She knew that she was one of those people. She did not know the specific shape of what came next. She was going to Raleigh first to help her mother with the hydrangeas, and to sleep in a room that had been hers since she was 8 years old, and to eat food that tasted like home for a while. After that, the shape would become clearer. It always did. Her father had taught her that too. You do the next right thing. The one after that announces itself in time. She drove south through the November morning, and the light came in at a low angle through the windshield, and the cracked glass scattered it across the dashboard in a pattern that was neither beautiful nor ugly. Just present, just what it was. In the spring in Raleigh, Sarah and her mother sat on the back porch in the early evening with coffee that was considerably better than anything available at Fort Liberty. The hydrangeas had been cut. The yard had the orderly quality of a space that is regularly tended by someone who finds tending it satisfying, which Margaret Callahan found genuinely satisfying in the way that certain people find certain forms of maintenance genuinely satisfying. They sat in the comfortable silence of people who have been through enough together that silence between them carries everything that does not need to be said aloud. Sarah's left hand rested in her lap. She flexed the index finger at intervals. The lag was slightly less than it had been in November. Not dramatically less, measurably less. Decker's assessment of the ceiling had been accurate, and she was approaching that ceiling from below, which was the correct direction. Her mother asked if she had made a decision. Not entirely, Sarah said, some of it. Her mother said, he would have told you the decision was already made and you were just catching up to it. Sarah looked at her coffee. He told me a lot of things, she said. Her mother said, he told me you'd finish what he started. He said it like there wasn't a question about it. They were quiet for a while. The evening light moved across the porch in the slow way of April light, which takes its time and does not apologize for it. Sarah reached into the breast pocket of her jacket and took out the envelope. She opened it and took out the photograph, the one Drakey had kept for 37 years, the one that had been in her father's inside pocket for part of its journey before that. Two men at a range, the line from shoulder to cheek. She held the photograph and looked at it with the quality of attention she brought to things that mattered, which was the quality of being fully present with them, not analyzing, not processing, just being there with what they were. The figure on the left was young. The field had not yet done to him what it would eventually do, which was change the face into something more specific and less easily readable. But the posture was already formed. The posture had been formed before this photograph and would remain after it because some things are built early enough that they become structural. Her posture, his posture, the same. She put the photograph back in the envelope and the envelope back in her left breast pocket. She drank her coffee. Her mother asked if she was staying for dinner. She was staying for dinner. The evening light continued its unhurried passage across the porch. The yard was quiet. The neighborhood was quiet. Fort Liberty was 5 hours north, and the events of November were 5 months behind her, and the work that would come next was still taking shape in the part of her mind where things that are not yet ready to be conscious take shape in their own time. She did not hurry it. She had learned from the man in the photograph that the most important things are done at the right time rather than the fast time, and that the patience required to wait for the right time is not the absence of urgency, but a different and more sophisticated relationship with it. She had been learning that lesson since she was 8 years old. She thought she was getting better at it. There are final things that should be said because completeness requires them, And because the people involved deserved to have what happened to them recorded accurately. Derek Briggs was convicted at court-martial of multiple counts of passing classified information to foreign intelligence services, conspiracy to commit murder and conduct unbecoming. He was sentenced to 22 years. He served his sentence in a federal military facility, and the 14 names he provided on the asphalt outside the administrative building at Fort Liberty led to prosecutions that removed a network of compromised personnel from positions where they had been causing damage for years. The 3 graduates of James Callahan's program who had died in Afghanistan were posthumously reviewed. Their casualty designations were changed. Their families were notified. It was not enough. It was what was possible. The Fort Liberty Sniper Program's safety and integrity record improved substantially in the 2 years following the November events under Drakey's supervision. The improvements were documented and distributed to comparable programs at other installations as a model for addressing the specific vulnerabilities that had been exposed. Drakey did not take credit for the improvements publicly. He took responsibility for them, which is a different thing and more expensive. Gideon Marsh remained at Fort Liberty for another 3 years before retiring. The Macmillan TAC 338 with serial number JC004 remained in the arms room inventory under the correct filing, no longer misfiled, no longer requiring careful oversight to remain in place. It had served its purpose. It was preserved because it deserved to be preserved and because Drake believed that certain items carry enough meaning that destroying them is a form of carelessness, that an institution can afford less than it thinks. He was right about that, as James Callahan had been right about most things. On the day Marsh retired, he stopped at the arms room and looked at the container in the 3rd row left side. He did not open it. He stood there for a moment with the specific quality of stillness that he had spent 30 years learning and that the man who had taught him would have recognized immediately. Then he went to his car and drove home. A year after Fort Liberty, the investigative work that Sarah Callahan continued to do in the quiet and careful way that her father had pioneered led to the identification of a second network operating in a different part of the defense structure. The methodology was the same. The patience was the same. The willingness to operate outside the official structure when the official structure was the problem was the same. The results were the same. She was not at Fort Liberty when this work concluded. She was in a different city, working under a different name, moving through a different context with the same quality of attention she had brought to everything since she was 8 years old. And a man handed her a rifle and said, "Pay attention to what your hands are doing. Pay attention to what the rifle is telling you. Pay attention to everything all the time and let the attention do its work." She paid attention. She let the attention do its work. This is in the end what her father had given her. Not the shooting, though the shooting was extraordinary. Not the physiological control or the ballistic knowledge or the patience that could hold a sight picture through conditions that most shooters could not hold it through. All of those things were real and all of them mattered, and none of them was the deepest thing. The deepest thing was the attention itself. The ability to be completely present in a moment, to let everything that is not essential fall away until only the task remains, and to bring to the task the full weight of everything you have been given, and everything you have built, and everything you owe to the people who built it with you. She brought that to everything she did. She had learned it from a man who had it naturally and who spent 19 years and 34 years and a lifetime, all the same lifetime, passing it to everyone he could reach. 14 rounds, 14 minutes. August 1991. November years later, the same lesson, the same number, the same understanding delivered across 30 years through the hands of a father and the hands of his daughter. The finger points at the moon. The finger is not the moon, but sometimes when the finger is steady enough and the light is right and the moment arrives with the specific clarity that moments of genuine necessity tend to arrive with, the pointing is exact. And that is everything.